It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Karen Fingerman. Dr. Fingerman holds degrees from Harvard and the University of Michigan, where she earned her PhD. She also completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University. Currently, Dr. Fingerman is a professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences in the School of Human Ecology and our partner at the College of Natural Sciences, where she holds the Sonia Wolf Wilson Regents Administrative Professorship in Human Ecology. Karen also connects to the College of Liberal Arts and serves as the Director of Research for the new Center on Aging and Population Sciences, housed here in the Population Research Center in the College of Liberal Arts. Her research focuses on adult development and aging, looking at how relationships with family members, friends, and others evolve over young adulthood into advanced age. Very grateful to have all of these faculty and all of you here today. And with that, I will turn it over and thank Karen for leading today's discussion.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the College of Liberal Arts for giving us this opportunity to be a part of this series. As Dean Stevens said, I am the Director of Research for the newly launched Center on Aging and Population Sciences. The director of the center is Dr. Deborah Umbersam, who's in the Department of Sociology. And we feel very fortunate. We received a large center grant from the National Institute on Aging. We're one of 13 places in the country that were awarded these centers, and we feel extremely privileged to be a part of investigation of aging in the population. Texas is the future of aging. Aging is our future, but Texas is the future of aging when you look at our population. And so the UT Austin Center has been focusing on some of the key issues that are of interest as populations grow older. One of these is the life course precursors of later life health and well-being. And what we mean by that is what happens in childhood continues throughout your whole life, as does young adulthood, as does midlife. We also look at family demography, social engagement, and social isolation. Loneliness and social isolation are a growing pandemic, particularly during the current pandemic. And finally, we look at place and health, including neighborhoods, geographic region, and other indicators of place. And I am going to turn this over to Dr. Mark Hayward from the Department of Sociology, who is the world's leading expert on life course precursors of late life health and well-being. He coined the term, the long arm of childhood, which has influenced the entire field and everything that we are looking at today to understand how people are going to age now and in the future. So let me turn that over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Karen. Let me say that that title has probably resulted in 20 extra pounds because I've been able to dine out on that title for quite a while. I want to thank you all for the invitation to talk to you today and have a conversation. I'm joined with my colleague, Chandra Muller. Chandra and I have known each other pretty well since I came here in 2005, and we've recently figured out that our research agendas have come together in significant ways. And I think this is the kind of time for us to have this conversation to say, well, what is it about education that is so important for us understanding cognitive risk and resilience? So you might wonder, what are a bunch of demographers doing looking at Alzheimer's disease? So I'm showing you in this screen, I'm showing you the projections of what the Alzheimer's Association shows members of Congress whenever they want extra money. And the reason is that it's actually a quite terrifying set of numbers, because it is the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in the United States. Here we have that prevalence broken out by age groups. And what you will see between 2020, which is just past us, and 2040 is that we're projected to have double in the number of people who present with Alzheimer's conditions. So we're seeing this particularly at the age groups for 85 years of age and older. some significant increases in 75 to 84, not as much increase as you can see in the younger ages. So a lot of what we see on the sheer numbers of people, which indicate the level of burden in the population and the level of burden in the communities and on families, is represented by these numbers. Now, what's odd, I don't know if it's odd or not, maybe I shouldn't say that. If I were on an airplane and I was saying, why are, what I was doing for a living, someone would say, oh my God, well, what, I'm not sure I want to live that long, because if I live to an old age, I'm going to get Alzheimer's disease. And what people actually don't know in the general population is that Alzheimer's disease and other dementias are quite malleable, and they're very much sensitive to a variety of conditions that are experienced over the life course. One of the most fundamental conditions that we experience is education. We think this should be a really simple relationship, right? We think, well, why is education so important for dementia? And you would be surprised how little research there has been done on this topic up until the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years. We have recently shown the role of education in understanding recent US downward trends in dementia. So yes, we actually have some good news with respect to dementia trends. Yes, the sheer numbers of people with dementia and Alzheimer's will go up. The actual proportion of the people in the population has been going down since 2000 and is continuing today. Whether it will continue in the future, I'm certainly open to having conversation about that. The other thing I'm going to talk to you about is how does education influence the number of years of life that people live with this condition. This is a very important metric when we think about our own individual lives and individual burden, and how our families come to grips with care over a period of time. And again, we're going to look at this, break it down, think about who benefits, who are the winners, and who are the losers. And I've used this to set up what I think of as a really important new study that's being done by Chandra Muller and some of her colleagues around the country, which is, I think of it as the best way to understand the way in which education gets under the skin and into the brain and affects dementia. So I'm quite excited to be at the same institution that Chandra is, because I think this is, new data, important data that speak to the kind of critical problems. She represents that phase of the work here at the Pop Center. So you might be surprised about why education is so important for understanding cognitive aging. One of the things that we have constantly been surprised at is how robust this association is across social groups within the United States and even across countries. So, we're going to look at this for the United States, but I will give you an example that really surprised us. We were looking at Black Americans aged 65 years and older and how education was related to the risk of dementia. And then we went to look at a South African study, which is based on a group of Black South Africans who were raised during apartheid. And the associations are starkly similar, and yet very, very different conditions under which people grew up. The other part about education being linked to dementia is through the establishment of cognitive abilities. I know we think we know this, but I'd like to bring it to the forebrain. It's really important to know that education is the time in which we acquire new knowledge, learn how to keep the knowledge in mind, and learn how to respond to a changing and dynamic environment. These are not trivial issues because they really are the kinds of traits that speak to a lifelong set of skills that education imparts. The other part is that schools are immersing students in this cognitively challenging environment so that they get a chance, a long-term period of exposure to pick up these skills over a period of time. And last but not least, education occurs, biologically speaking, when cognitive development is very rapid. And some evidence also supports the idea that ages of peak cognitive performance occur later with more years of education. I keep telling my graduate students that as I subject them to the comprehensive exams. I said, you'll really benefit from these. No pain, no gain. So I want to show you now is a set of graphs, and I'll try and be as clear as possible about what they mean to give you a sense for how we have been thinking about the role of education and understanding long-term downward trends in dementia. So I have a graph here that shows the trend in dementia prevalence, which is the proportion of people who have a condition over time. And one of the things that I'm showing here is I'm not controlling for education here. So you see the downward trend among non-Hispanic Blacks 75 years of age and older. You see the downward trend among whites in the same age group. You see a downward trend among younger Blacks 65 to 74, and you see a downward trend among whites, younger whites as well, in the blue line below. The point is, it doesn't really matter, in some extent, what age group that you belong in and what race group you belong in. There is a general downward trend over this time period for what has been going on in terms of prevalence. Now, up until the study that we're publishing here, people have hypothesized it's education. I have no idea why they never looked at it empirically, and we went and did that. And what we have discovered is if you see that orange line which is downward becomes absolutely flat. If you see that green line, the green line becomes absolutely flat. All the lines become flat, which means that there is no trend when you control for education. Now you might say, well, maybe education is standing in for something else. So we actually looked at early childhood conditions, their health, their socioeconomic conditions when they were very young. We then looked at different kinds of adult exposures like occupation, and we controlled for hypertension and controlled hypertension and diabetes. All the things that you would think would be other contenders in understanding these downward trends. And none of them moved the trends one iota. They were all related to the risk of dementia at any one point in time. They simply didn't explain the downward trends that we're observing here. Now, one of the things I want you to keep in mind is that trends aren't necessarily evolutionary, and they won't always go down forever. And that will depend on the mix of the risk factors that are in the population itself. Now, here I've just shown you an example of why education moves that needle on population prevalence of dementia. It's because between 2000 and 2014, the time periods in which we were looking at, we saw literally a massive upgrading in the levels of educational attainment represented within the age groups that we were looking at in the analysis. So in some ways, we have a surprisingly malleable social factor like education. People think of it as not mutable. It's quite mutable. And here we have a good example of how mutable it is. Life changed fast in those days for a lot of population groups. And life improved, at least in terms of dementia risk, over that time period. The next thing I'm going to show you, the next piece of information, is how education influences those years of life that people spend with dementia. Here I'm showing on the graph, you can think of these bars as the number of years of dementia life expectancy. So we have three groups of education. We have less than high school, we have high school graduates, and then we have college graduates. And you'll see for the less than high school graduates that Black Americans can expect to spend about 3.8 years with dementia compared to white Americans with less than high school of about 2.15. There's a couple things going on in this graph which make life interesting if you're a demographer, and I think life interesting in general to understand the heterogeneity of experiences of people out there in the population. So if you just look at the orange bars, what you'll see is this nice stair step, 3.8, 2.3, 1.6, in terms of the number of years of dementia life expectancy. And there is a clear educational benefit for Black Americans. The same is true for white Americans, only they start out in a different place. They start out with lower levels of dementia life expectancy, about 2.2 down to 1.3 and down to 1 year. So you can see for both Blacks and whites, we have this strong educational gradient, but there is a race difference that persists. Now, if you look at the college-educated African Americans here, they're 1.65. I've just drawn a bar across to give you some perspective on the disparities that exist for the race and education groups. So that 1.65 is longer than the 1.34 that whites with high school can expect to spend it with dementia. So even with college, African Americans do not appear to catch up with whites in this analysis who have a high school education. At this stage, college appears to be the gold standard right now. We don't have enough data to move beyond whether further levels of education beyond college are having an impact. And I hope at some point that we're going to be able to look at that, because the increase in the post-graduate population has been pretty significant. Now, the reason I'm putting this out is that we know a lot, or we're learning a lot about how things like education are mattering and how it gets under the skin and into the brain, but we're actually just scratching the surface, if you will. I've given you a sense here. Here's a set of boxes from childhood to midlife to older adulthood that contain some what we think of as major and malleable risk factors that ultimately affect cognitive health, cognitive decline, and dementia risk. They come from two important phases of the life course: the developmental phase, where people are building their cognition and they're building their brains, and they come from the aging phase of your human life course, where we have cognitive function and cognitive reserve, and neurodegeneration and pathology. Somehow all of these variables, and probably other variables that I have not pulled into play, are having an important role. We do not yet know how all of these factors combine together. We do not know the major pathways by which maybe potentially education sets up a cascade effect that affects dementia through different mechanisms. So there's a variety of things still to be tested out. Though I will say that this is the kind of model that we're using. I'm a part of a National Academy of Science committee. It's called the Decadal Committee on Dementia and the Social Sciences, and we're writing a report for the National Academy on the role of social science research in looking at dementia and research for the next 10 years. And as you can see, we start out with a basic framework that I've shown here. It's the kind of framework that has a lot of flexibility built into it, but but if you were to go to the report, which I've seen recently, there's more questions, let me say, than there are answers about how all of these factors are related to the risk of dementia. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to turn it over to Chandra. One last comment is that the Chandra study in the high school and beyond joins other studies out there in the United States, which have been so fundamental in our understanding, and I just listed them above. You might wonder, why do we have multiple studies? And I will tell you, no one study can do everything that we need to do, and each study has complementary strengths. And I think Chandra's study fills in some really significant gaps. So Chandra, I'm going to stop sharing and
Mark, before we go to Chandra, we have had a question, which is,
Sure.
Do you know anything about ongoing treatments for dementias? Because we've had a question about, from someone who's dealing with this issue in their family. Their mother was diagnosed. It's been progressing, over the past few years.
Yes. So do you want me to stop sharing? go ahead and ask the question. What is the question?
The question is, my mother was diagnosed with dementia 11 years ago.
Yeah.
It has progressed significantly in the last 4 years. Can you discuss the latest innovations in treating more advanced dementia?
I hate to be a downer, but we don't have any good therapeutic alternatives right now. If you have been looking at some of the clinical trial research recently, there was some buzz, and we still don't know where the buzz is going to come out on a new drug therapy that might yield some benefits, but currently we really have no excellent therapeutic options, and I think that's one of the most discouraging aspects of this syndrome is the long, potentially in some cases, like her mom, can be quite drawn out, right? And to not have those kinds of drugs, that's an issue. Now, let me just flip that back a little bit, Karen, and say, what can you do in terms of things that actually seem to affect the disease progression? And they're actually behavioral and social. So part of the behavior is we know that physical activity, even among people that have dementia, is actually quite positive in terms of slowing the progression of the disease. Social isolation is a severe risk factor for speeding up the progression of the disease. In the pandemic, we're already worried about people with dementia that have become even more socially isolated than they have been in the past. So surprisingly, in moving the needle in terms of disease progression, we're actually getting more purchase on the social and behavioral side than we are getting on the medical side. No one's giving up on the medical side. Trust me, they're looking. This is a major problem, and they're not stopping looking at this problem. So, but this is a wily disease. It's a multifactorial. It's complicated. There are lots of things. There are lots of other kinds of dementias that intertwine with each other. So I cannot tell you the kind of how complex the etiology of this disease is. So.
I'm just going to add a couple of comments from UT Austin. So if immediately you want to know something about, how to get some treatment, the neurology department has the Mulva Clinic. It's MULVA. It's a very new clinic, but it is providing the state of the art with regard to what Mark just said, with regard to the things that can be done behaviorally and socially. And they're really state of the art. Within their first year of existing, they won the state of Texas for clinical care facilities. Yeah. So it's an outpatient. It's wonderful. Please contact them. And the other thing I want to let you know is that UT is certainly very invested in getting this solved. And so there's what's called a cluster hire, which means they're hiring in multiple departments, including psychology in liberal arts. And what the goal of that is, it's to look at diversity in brain aging. So to address some of these issues that Mark raised, like African Americans having a higher rate of dementia, and doing things like brain imaging and looking at obesity as a risk factor. Our psychology department is truly cutting edge, and they're adding some more hires to that. We do have one more question. Yeah, we do have some answers that are showing that, yes, it shows up almost 20 years ahead, somebody posted, and that we've got some really terrific research in our psychology department here at UT. And you also have the link to the Mulva Clinic right there. So please consider, I think you'll be extremely happy if you are able, not happy, that's the wrong word, but you will be, feel that you are being taken care of if you go to the Mulva Clinic.
Karen, can I just comment on the Mulva Clinic? I brought the clinic to the attention of my National Academy Committee because it really is a model care, and I don't know how many people have experienced this with an older relative or friend, but a lot of times in a kind of solitary environment with a clinical assessment, the first comment out of a physician's mouth is, well, I would get your financial affairs in order. And this is an actual traumatic and very difficult situation to go through. And the MOLVA clinic wraps around both the person that's been diagnosed and the family members and caregivers. They wrap around information resources, social support resources, and they're looking after both the caregiver and the person living with dementia. So I think that they really care about this kind of partnership that we see out there, understanding that for a person with dementia to have the best care, everyone needs to be involved. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. It really is an amazing place.
Yeah, I'm glad we had an opportunity, and I'm glad for the question, because it gave us the opportunity to tell you a little more about UT, that the College of Liberal Arts is really cutting across the whole university in different ways to solve these problems. And I'm glad we had the opportunity to tell you about that. I am going to follow Mark's lead to turn this over to Chandra, and I just want to be sure that everyone here understands how important Chandra's work is, and how important it is that she's moving to look at aging, because she is probably the world's leading expert on education earlier in life and through adolescence. And I just want to say that the College of Liberal Arts is incredibly fortunate at UT to have both Mark Hayward and Chandra Muller, and to have the kind of collaboration they bring. So Chandra, I'll let you tell them a little bit about what you've been doing and what you're going to do.
Well, thank you. And Mark and Karen, thank you for the kind words. I'm not sure I deserve them. I would say also, Mark, that you, along with Deb Umberson and many others throughout the university, were instrumental in getting the project that I'm going to talk about up and running today. We started it back in 2012, and we had many meetings and lots of input. And I think, Mark, you in particular saw some of the potential that none of the rest of us saw at the time. So thank you. I'm going to try the screen sharing. I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen when I launch the PowerPoint. So you can see it now, right? Yes?
We can see it. Yeah, thanks, Chandra.
Okay. I'll go ahead and launch it. So today I'm going to talk about the high school and beyond study, which we got up and running again, the midlife follow-up here at UT. Started getting it up and running back in 2011 and got our first funding in 2012. We recently got new funding to study dementia. And so I'll end up talking about connections to Mark's work, but I want to give you a little bit of background on the study first. This is a study that actually began in 1980, and it was my first research project as a graduate student. So my dissertation advisor was the principal investigator for this study, and I got hooked on education, sociology of education research, and sociology through this, really, in many ways. As I said, it started in 1980 when seniors and sophomores in high school were first interviewed, and they were given cognitive tests and all kinds of surveys and so on. At the time, it was cutting edge. It still is, actually. I think the Department of Education that ran this study still sees it really as their crown jewel in many ways. And it sets the gold standard for surveys today. It started out very large, 60,000 students, and whittled down to 27,000 who were followed longitudinally over time. These were people who were born 1961 to 1965. To put it into context, right now they're about just before age 60, around age 60. So linking back to what Mark was talking about, this is a group that's just a wee bit younger than Mark's youngest people in his analysis of declines in dementia. So we would expect to see these people doing a little bit better, in large part because education had progressed. These are the kids who came up through the Great Society programs. They were born into those programs, and into an acceleration of people going into college. In particular, this was a time when people of color and women went into college in droves compared to what they had been doing. And they stayed in the workforce. Women did certainly stay in the workforce. There were affirmative action programs and so on to give opportunities to people of color. So it's an important cohort. It's also the cohort that was born around the changes in immigration laws. So many of the immigrants are immigrants of color. So it's an interesting group, and it's right before a huge acceleration in spending and emphasis on educational rigor. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So it's an interesting cohort. And then back, like I said, in 2012, we got money to go back and find them, which was a chore. They had last been interviewed in either 1986 or 1992. Up until then, there was very, very high response rate. 70% of the cohort had responded to all waves of the survey. That's just unheard of now. People don't respond to surveys as much, but we went back and we found almost all of them. We got 65% to answer our surveys, which is a highly respectable number, and asked them mostly about work. At the time, they were around age 50. And so and it was right after the Great Recession. We were wondering what factors would predict their working longer. There are a lot of obvious policy implications from that. We also got their records, death records and so on. So we knew who had died and the causes of their death. We put that all together along with the early factors that we had measured to understand something about work and health and so on over the life course. So I'm going to tell you a couple of results just to give you a sense of what was produced from this wave. We're still working with the data, but we have lots of things that we found already. So before I do that, let me tell you about the high school coursework, just because it's so important in some of our findings. Now, we had full high school transcripts and college transcripts for all 20, all of the respondents. And the US Department of Education has emphasized course taking a lot. They've spent a lot of money in upgrading to more rigorous courses and giving guidance about how to do that. So we categorized the courses that students took kind of along the lines of what you see here. Advanced coursework puts you into the four-year colleges and the more selective colleges. The medium coursework, or can still get you into colleges, but it's not so much honors. You take some foreign language, but not a lot. You still take the better math, but not the most advanced math, and maybe a couple of years of science. Then there are people who have taken a general level of coursework, maybe very low levels of algebra, not much science, and no foreign language. And they may leave high school. This cohort had about a 15% high school dropout rate, but those who did graduate were underprepared for college. There's been a lot of work showing these relationships, and they, predict who successfully completes college and who earns higher wages and so on. Well, what we did was we took this paradigm and linked it to people's self-rated health status at midlife. So they told us whether they saw themselves in excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor health. And this indicator is used across many studies and has been linked to actual health outcomes. So we thought it was a good place to start. And what we found was that the course taking patterns actually quite strongly predicted that health status. So let me walk you through this figure. On the right-hand side, the orange hump, mound, peak shows the observed health status for our sample members who took that advanced course sequence. So they were pretty well prepared for college. And you can see that nearly all of them had very good or excellent health. The blue curve shows the health status for the people who took the lower level of coursework. Those people had lower health status and worse health status, and actually some of them fare. And I should also mention that this also predicts mortality. So then we asked, well, in this cohort, actually a fair number of people, 60% of the cohort took no math at all in their senior year of high school, took no science either for the most part. 15% took no math senior or junior year of high school, even when they were prepared. They had high test scores, they had high grades, everything was going in their favor, the courses were offered at their schools, and they just didn't take the courses. So we took those people, we called them prepared to take the coursework, but who didn't. And we said, well, what would we project their health status to be if they had gone ahead and taken that higher level of academic coursework? And that's where what you see those predicted lines as showing. So the black line shows the curve for the sample that would have very good or excellent health had all students who were simply prepared to take the coursework actually taken it. And then the white line shows how we would have fewer people in that good or fair category. So this actually is just kind of the tip of the iceberg for our findings. We looked across all kinds of outcomes, from work to other forms of health to being economically insecure and so on. And we found incredibly strong effects of course taking in high school for long-term outcomes. We also looked at something else, and that had to do with who was actually dying and why. A lot has come out recently about deaths of despair as a function of the changing labor market and the fall in the working class or the fall of the middle class, where there are fewer jobs, good jobs that don't require a college degree. So we originally thought, well, we have the data, we can see who didn't get those jobs and predict their mortality that way. So we did that, and we found something that at first surprised us a bit and then didn't surprise us at all. And that is that the risk of deaths of despair, that is deaths from suicide or drug poisoning, it's about 3 times higher among men who expected to earn enough money, have an occupation that produced a family wage, but that occupation declined during their adulthood. They were much more likely to die of suicide or drug poisoning. And this was independent of the actual occupation that they held in early adulthood. We were able to look at that. We think it's because the occupation was core to their identity, and they took courses and they did all sorts of things in high school that formed that identity, that ideal of what their adulthood would be like. And as they went through their adulthood, the status of these jobs changed and they went away. And we linked this to deaths of despair. So now I want to talk a little bit about where we're headed. I didn't talk much about the achievement tests that were given to these high school students when they were in high school, but I'll bring that up now because we're headed toward research on cognitive aging, what Mark was talking about. The tests that were given to these high school students are listed here, and the seniors in particular got some tests that are kind of the ideal tests for measuring dementia later. They are essentially the adolescent version of tests that have been shown to be strongest predictors of dementia, and they have to do with quantitative skills, some of them pattern recognition and memory. So our students took these tests. We have their early adolescent scores. One of the real puzzles in cognitive aging research is we know that kids start out in very different places in high school. We know that their experiences over adulthood contribute to additional learning. For example, you learn in work, you learn in other settings. But we don't know how, and we don't know how much of that is contextual or social versus something biological. So with the data that we're collecting, we should be able to unpack some of these things in a unique way. Going back to that timeline that I showed you at the beginning, we've just been funded to do a second midlife follow-up in 2021, which is quite a challenge during COVID. We had an interesting pilot season, and it should be an interesting data collection as well, but so far, so good. We're giving cognitive tests to people. We're asking them questions about their work, their health, their social support and isolation, and also collecting biomarkers. We're collecting saliva, blood, and other measures like height, weight, blood pressure, and COVID tests and COVID antigens tests. From all of this, along with some record linkages, we hope to be able to put a picture together to link those early life experiences very concretely. What happened in high school, in college, and early adulthood that might predict and allow us to make connections to who is aging cognitively at a very young age, really. At age 60, 58 to 60 is still pretty young. But we do expect to see some differences, and our pilot data certainly suggested that we would. I'll just say that this is funded by, the most recent follow-up is funded by the National Institute of Aging mainly, with some fairly significant grants, and then also the Alzheimer's Association has gave us the money for the pilot.
We have one question about retinal scans to evaluate beta amyloid protein buildup. I don't know if either of you want to comment on that. I know there are a lot of new diagnostics and new attempts to try to detect particularly the presence of Alzheimer's disease using different approaches that are simplified beyond the brain scan. I don't know if you have an opinion on those or on particular the retinal scan.
The biomarker area is one in where it changes weekly. So I will say that there are shifting sands on this issue. The retinal scan, from my understanding, is a relatively recent test. So I don't know the sensitivity and specificity of the test itself. And I think we will employ whatever techniques that we can at the current time. So remember, a lot of these studies are longitudinal. they're kind of technology in some sense is set in time when you begin to collect the data. So I'm relying on the health and retirement study. Chandra can use different kinds of assays potentially, so part of it is we don't mix and match. And the retinal scan has been used in some epi studies. So, it's out there, but it's not in the data that I've been using because go ahead.
I've been on a steep learning curve with this, and I'll say, Mark, changes weekly might not be frequently enough. I think it's almost daily. And we were on a call yesterday with the HRS people, and I think they're going to use some of what we're doing because with respect to COVID, if you collect certain kinds of data, part of your strategy is actually to store data and to collect it in a way that can be facile so that you can use whatever the cutting edge science is at the moment to do an analysis. And then there are some debates about what to squirrel away. I don't know enough about retinal scanning to say anything on that, but one thing I've learned recently that I think is super important is that the indicators for Alzheimer's and dementia may be different depending on your life experiences. And that may be different for people of color. So this is just clearly a very complicated area. It's fascinating because of it, where the social and the biological come together in ways that one has to be really very thoughtful about.
I'm going to jump in. There's a lot of really, really interesting questions in the chat. One of them I'm going to address because I think I apologize that I didn't do this right at the start. So there's a question about what is dementia and what is Alzheimer's disease. So just to clarify that, dementia is actually a cluster of symptoms. It's things like memory loss, deterioration of language, some spatial skills that are no longer, it's hard, people get disoriented. All of those things are dementia. And dementia has many causes, all of which are in the brain. So Alzheimer's disease is by far the most common cause of dementia and the one that we hear the most about. But dementia can also come from something called Lewy body syndrome. That was the one that Robin Williams had at the time that he ended up dying. There's also Parkinson's can lead to dementia. HIV can lead to dementia. So it's a cluster of those syndromes, and something goes wrong in the brain, and it produces this shared sort of constellation of problems that we see manifest as behavior. So we've primarily been talking about Alzheimer's because it is by far the most common, but all of these things, one of the problems we have is differentiating them. Oh, I should have added vascular dementia, which means strokes. And sometimes people have Alzheimer's and they have little strokes. So there's a lot that goes on, not just in what leads to it, but even what it is in the brain. So that was a really good question, and I'm glad you raised it for the person who did. And the other questions for Chandra and Mark, I think.
Karen, before you go on, I think people need to know that the definition itself has been in flux for some time, and whether we should be going more specific or more general. And for a long time, the epidemiologists were driving us to more specific, and then they realized that if you look at the comorbidities, there's almost no one who has one kind of dementia. They all co-occur with each other. The other thing I need to clarify with the biomarker side is that we are still unclear how mechanistic these biomarkers in terms of their biological pathways are operating, which means, are they really explanations of the disease, or are they potentially outcomes of the disease, or are they something else causing them that is related to the disease? So the biomarker area is very difficult to understand. The Alzheimer's Association has been pushing to use biomarkers as a kind of way of defining the Alzheimer's disease. There is a lot of pushback. This is a very volatile area for discussion. So I just wanted to add that to that.
Yeah, there's so those amyloid plaques that someone asked about earlier are very, very often found in Alzheimer's disease brains, but not always. And
Not always.
yeah, and you can find the amyloid plaques in a brain where the person died functioning perfectly fine. So we really don't know we just don't have enough clarity, although we're doing so much research that we're anticipating a lot of these breakthroughs. The other question we're seeing a lot on, and probably we might have anticipated this, Chandra and Mark, is what is the role of the COVID isolation in these processes, both in predicting future and in the fact that the people who have been most vulnerable, the people who have dementia currently, are the most isolated. So if you could comment on that, I think that a lot of people have been very interested.
So actually, this is something that we have been thinking about. It's quite clear that COVID has had a big effect on dementia, both through social isolation and possibly other social processes, but also physiologically. And because brain fog and we don't know much about it. The phone call I was on yesterday between people who were in Europe and actually here, toward the end said, are we missing anything? Do we have an opportunity here with the high school and beyond study that, nobody else has or we haven't thought of? And several of them said, yes, it's the COVID issues, because we'll be collecting the data right around that time period. And we know that it's just had enormous effects. I actually wouldn't be surprised if that ended up being one of our uniquely biggest sets of findings.
Yeah, it's going to be a sequela for sure. Absolutely. But Karen, the two components come in with COVID, as Chandra was saying. I mean, part of it is it's just simply the stress in the environment that surrounds COVID. And for people who have dementia, stress will accelerate the progression of the disease. The other part is that they become socially isolated. That's what, and Chandra was pointing this out. Social engagement is one of the ways to really slow the progression of the disease. So they have a kind of heightening of the risk factor, and they have a withering away of the support and protective factors. So COVID,
and I think another puzzle here is that any kind of cognitive impairment could actually increase the likelihood of contagion. So there could be very complicated things happening here.
I'm going to add one more question to this that I've been thinking about a little, and I think Chandra, this is just a sort of hypothetical speculate beyond data, and that is that we're seeing tremendous educational disparities and disruptions right now. And what are we going to be able to catch up later? I've heard ideas about like a summer tutoring program for every child who's behind, and I'm just wondering what you see as the prognosis and the interventions for the future.
So this isn't related to aging as much as just having a cohort that's behind, and many people are worried about it. And of course, there have been some estimates in the news about how far behind. And of course, there's enormous inequality. And well, as somebody who studies education, I can't tell you how worried I am about it. I think this could have major consequences, but really not only for kids and young adults who are going through the COVID isolation component, but the stressors and the issues related to the economic recession and the inequality that's produced is terrifying. To be a downer.
Yeah. I'll add one other thought that's a little bit of a downer, which is that there's also physiological issues. And certainly I'm a psychologist by training, and in the field of psychology, one of the big issues right now is that the virus appears to break through the blood-brain barrier, which is to say either that or there's inflammation in the brain. We are seeing neurological consequences even in asymptomatic. And what's also evidenced is that from the Spanish flu pandemic in the early 20th century, in the aftermath, about 10 years later, they saw a huge increase, a blip, if you will, in dementia and Parkinson's, interestingly. And so there is some concern that the longer term effect on dementia of the earlier even asymptomatic, but okay, because I don't want to be like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Now stay panicked for 10 years. We know this now, and that is huge. That is huge. We know that inflammation may be the mechanism. We can start to work on that now. So that earlier question, did this start 20 years ago? Well, psychologists are already aware of it. They're already thinking about it. They're already saying, what are we going to do going forward? So I think that on the one hand, the consequences don't look good, but on the other hand, our awareness and our scientific research and our understanding of how to intervene may put us in a better position than in the past. And the fact that we're all here and we're talking about it. So yeah, I'm really grateful for those questions. And
there was a very interesting article that came out in December in JAMA about the economic insecurity and instability and its relationship to dementia. It's apparently one of the earlier predictors of dementia. And I keep thinking about those connections for our economic situation for so many people who are in their 50s at that kind of vulnerable time where they've lost work or they have unstable work right now, and what that can do as well.
So, Chandra, that's a really important point. I think we're at the tail end of this downward slope for dementia prevalence. And I think that we're going to see some changes. We've already seen a hint with respect to diabetes in terms of and body mass, in terms of it kind of maybe helping smooth out, and we could see an increase. Stress is a huge risk factor for for dementia long term. So the kinds of issues that you're pointing to, I think that's the other part, is this is a kind of a wily problem that's filled with exposures and experiences over the entire life course. And those changes are going to certainly affect and be drivers. One thing that Karen said I think is really critical too, every physician better screen for whether you had COVID from here on out, and they should be looking for different kinds of disease sequelae. And they should be looking all over the body, because the number of body systems, biological systems and organs that have been influenced among the survivors, and this is why even for kids, it's important to ask this question and have this information at hand. So it's going to be around with us.
And based on Mark's research, I should add that, when I talk to college students and to young people, there's this sense of invulnerability. Well, if I get it, I'll recover. It doesn't matter. I can do what I want because it's such a low rate of, driving's more dangerous for me. But I heard a really good analogy, which is it's like having a stroke. Survival isn't the only outcome. It's you don't want the damage that it could have done. Now, again, I don't want to leave that that fear and anxiety of, oh my gosh, I had it. I want to leave an awareness that you got to work on the things you can do then, because we do know a lot more about prevention. And so finding that out and talking to your physician, like Mark said. The other thing that occurred to me is that Deb Umbersom, who's the director of the Center on Aging and Population Sciences and a colleague of Mark and Chandra's, and just the absolutely amazing sociology department, one of the things in her research that she looks at is exposure to death. And what that means is if your friends and relatives are dying, that's a tremendous hit to your system and a tremendous stress. And so that has been disproportional as well during this pandemic. To certain groups have had a lot more of it than other groups. But again, I think that the key thing there is that we have people doing research like Deb and figuring out then what do we do about it? We know now this is the problem. And I think that's really key and different from in the past. We've got another question that I think is really relevant and not necessarily COVID related, but kind of stemming from what you've both been doing, is the role of vitamins and diet in dementia. And I was thinking about that with regard to education, because people at different levels of education, of course, also have access to different kinds of food and eat differently. So I was wondering if you want to comment on that a little bit.
I'll take a stab at and say we don't know very much about diet and micronutrients. We have looked at early life. In some of the work I've done in other countries, we have looked at early life in terms of hunger and famine. And when children are very young and they're experiencing exuberant periods in brain development, and then looking at what happens in terms of pruning after that, like when they would be going to school. So there is a reason to look at nutrition, but it may not be the micronutrient ways in which we think of. I mean, I think partly it is we just don't have the information on how much the nutrients are influencing the biological mechanisms that would be like the inflammatory system and immune function that would be part of the pathophysiological ways of getting to an Alzheimer's outcome. So I think that
there is some interesting research on microbiomes and dementia. So we're collecting saliva, and we're going to do a microbiome analysis of the mouth. Even better would be the digestive system, but the methods to get those microbiomes weren't things that we wanted to try to do. But apparently there is quite a bit of research and exciting cutting edge research on these microbiome environments, which are probably related to some of the vitamins and what you eat diets and so on.
We also had a question about genetics and the role of genetics in Alzheimer's. If you want to talk a little bit about EPOE4 or whatever you want to talk about.
You want to talk about it, Chandra?
You probably know much more than I do, Mark. But from what I know, I'll just go back to the one issue of making sure to pay attention to the fact that we don't know how these things play out for people of color. There are quite different processes.
To build on what Chandra said, that I don't know how many people know this, but the APOE4 gene, which is the Alzheimer's gene, was really what got the Human Genome Project rolling in Washington, D.C., and it is how genetics were held out as having such great promise for helping us unpack different kinds of diseases. I would say we've never had a success since APOE4 that could even match up even in the slightest. Even in the case of APOE4, I mean, well, first let me say that we've looked at microsites, SNPs, polygenic risk scores, a variety of ways of kind of summarizing genetic data. And there's just some association. How it moves the needle is not clear. What role it is with respect to other factors isn't clear. It doesn't just stand out and jump at you as if you were, you had the answer right now anyway. So a lot of, this is to say we don't know that much. But even with APOE4, if you look at Black Americans and white Americans, for white Americans, the relationship between APOE4 and Alzheimer's is very strong. Guess what's not strong for Black Americans? The relationship between genes and the expression of dementia and Alzheimer's. So something is going on there, which suggests that the social environment is overwhelming whatever genetic effect is out there in the environment. And we still haven't unpacked how all of these simple relationships are operating together.
Yeah, I mean, there's even evidence that identical twins are not of equal probability to develop dementia. So it's way beyond that. And this allele that Mark is talking about, most of us have EPOE1. That's just the vast majority of us. So it's a small proportion of people who have it. They're at elevated risk. A very teeny proportion have what we call a double allele. So they got it from both their mom and their dad, very small proportion. And so that's the highest risk you could possibly have. And yet, even by age 85, when the rates have increased, there's still 20% who never develop it. So
Right.
even at the highest risk, and most of the dementias are not linked to EPOE4 because it just doesn't occur that much in the population. So there is one risk gene, and yet it really doesn't explain a whole lot. And so I just want to caution you, don't go out and try to get tested because it's just going to upset you. And, you're already upset because we told you COVID's going to create all these problems too. So, none of this you should panic about. They're all just interesting things we're learning and problems we're trying to solve. I'm just looking through, if anyone would like to add more to the chat.
I would say something about ethics, Karen, about some of the stuff on ethics and how we deal with some of these issues.
That would be terrific. Yeah, please.
So the biomarker issue, the effort to make biomarkers as part of the Alzheimer's definition comes with some ethical issues that have not been really thought through. I mean, it's one thing to say in an anonymized data set that we have information on a biomarker and we have information on their performance and assessments for dementia. It's another thing to say, what do we do with when we go into the doctor's office and we have that clinical information, that those biomarkers collected? What do we do with that information? Because it's not clear. Because as you know, oftentimes you can have these biomarkers. You look like you should test positive. You should have severe Alzheimer's, and you are A-okay. So, I mean, that's been the debate. How do you use this? How do you use the biological information in the clinical setting? It's not obvious yet because we still don't know how mechanistic these markers are. It doesn't appear that they're mechanistic as much as we would like them to be. And by mechanistic, I mean causal, right? And I think that's the dilemma. And so we should be cautious because when we hear language in the media, hear language in the newspapers and whatever, we shouldn't overly interpret that. We should think through carefully, what does this mean for me? Or what does it mean for my spouse? Or, I think that's how do we want to deal with that information? There's no logical outcome. And I think we have to bring in some ethicists to help us think through these issues. So we need philosophers.
We have one other question that I think we're going to make our last one. And I think it might be aimed a little more at you, Chandra, but what they want to know is the years and depth of education. Does it predict the severity of the disease? Not just sort of you get it, but do you get it in a worse way based on those factors?
Mark, you may actually want to weigh in here too. I'll just say that I can tell you what we expect. Because we will be looking a lot at the kinds of curricular exposure and aptitude in early life. What we expect is that it will affect more the age of onset than actually how the disease plays out once it's in its, once it starts to occur and people decline more rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, the jury is not fully, in agreement, but I agree with Chandra. The evidence with factors like education really are about building cognition, and it's not as much about when we get old, how fast do we decline in terms of is there a protective factor with respect to education and the speed at with which we decline. It's a debate. I think we're still working on it. But for the most part, the evidence is consistent with this idea that we have a clinical threshold of some score, and that the people with less education cross that line first, followed by the people with more education, and those curves are surprisingly parallel. So it really starts out, the gap that started out in cognitive abilities early in life is carried forward in through the life course, and it has a strong association for when you cross the finish line, so to speak, that threshold for dementia.
The other thing about education is that it allows people to get into other settings along the way during adulthood that helps them maintain their cognitive functioning.
Yeah.
So, and somebody asked about family dynamics and family support, and that's one great example that families function better among, I can think of families to which this doesn't apply, but when people are better educated, all other things equal. Sorry, Karen, you can show your cake.
Oh, I was just wrapping us up. No, I'm so glad. And your point was so well taken, Chandra. I'm so grateful that everyone was able to attend today. This is, keeping up your hobbies during the pandemic is also good for the brain. And attending today, we didn't say this, but education, yes, there's a lot that happens in early life, but all of adulthood is malleable. And the fact that you've attended today and learned new things was a really good boost for your brain. And we're very grateful to you all for attending.